guys, Brian here from Starlite Pulp. This is episode, I want to say somewhere around 18, 19, something like that. And today we have the very good fortune of having Mr. Joe R Lansdale with us. He has a book coming out very shortly, Collected Crime Stories, Things Get Ugly, which comes out, I believe, in August. So very happy to have Joe here. How you doing today, Joe?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. All right, so this new book, Things Get Ugly. This is a little bit of a career retrospective. Yeah, it covers quite a breadth of context over your career. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. There were other stories that we considered. I think there's probably even a couple of other stories that may be as good or better than some of those, but they've been published so much that we thought we would wait. Maybe we'll do a second volume and include them in that. But yeah, I'm happy with it because it's pretty much from the 80s on till now. So that's good.
That's good. Yeah. And so when you were putting the collection together, was it you working with your editor, or was it you choosing a lot of the stories, or what?
Yeah, I worked with my editor, Rick Claw, who is over at Tachyon, but we went through stories and said, this one fits, this one does. The truth of the matter is, anytime people want to put me in crime, horror, whatever, it becomes a mess when they start looking at the stories, because they go, well, this could fit anywhere. And that's not always exactly true, but it's somewhat true. A number of these could have been called horror and were published in horror outlets. And some could be called crime. Some are sort of, I don't know what you'd call them, just mainstreamish stories, weird stories, a combination thereof. So we had to kind of go through them and kick them around. That's sort of why we left two or three of them out that perhaps now I wish we had put in, but I think it's fine.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Good. I mean, that's one of the things, right? Is that we were actually talking a little bit about before we started recording, but there's this, people really like to corral and label what we do, right?
Yeah.
So this is a crime story. This is this is crime fiction. This is noir. This is horror. And so many of them cover so many genres.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, the thing is one reason that this is called crime stories is because it fits that genre well enough when you read the book. But I'm really not interested in all those labels. But for them to sell books, they're interested in different labels, and so some of these stories have been in like best of the year horror stories and what have you. It's just it's a matter of perspective, but it's a way of putting those stories out there. And even though some of these stories have been printed before, you have collectors who will say, well, I got the book that's got all those stories in it except maybe two. And I say, you got the book that's out of print and I'm still here. And there are new readers, and I want to supply them. I don't write these so that you just have the definitive edition and nobody else is going to see it. Exactly. I do these because I love writing them and I make a living at doing them. And I want them recycled because every year I have new people coming in that have never read me before and say, where can I get stories? And perhaps they can find a used copy, but it's always better if there's something fresh out there,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. And in fact, to that point, Joe, I actually tried recently to get a copy of Dead Man's Road and just couldn't get a copy anywhere. Like I had a copy years ago and I think I lent it to somebody. I don't have it anymore. And now I go on eBay and they're like $50. But it's like,
Dead Man's Road is in print, but it's in paperback at Tachyon. Same place people have published that. So you can get a copy there. I think it's still available. I could be wrong. If it's gone out of print, then I need to know that because I need to get it back in print. But I think you can get a paperback copy. You meant the original hardback. It's gone. I mean, they sold those out. There won't be any more than those unless you find a used one. But the paperback's in print, and as far as I know, is continuing to be in print.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I like that one a lot. That one's a lot of fun. I like Westerns just across the board. I like Westerns. But the fun part about, something like the concept of crime stories, right? Crime stories in here. So we oftentimes think detective fiction or what's considered crime fiction, but really you can put a crime in any fiction, right? I mean, you can put a crime in sci-fi, you can put a crime in horror, you can,
Great Gatsby is a crime novel.
Sure.
Great Gatsby has crime at its source, so I think that fits perfectly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So one story I want to talk about in here for sure that is a little bit of a genre
Sure.
bender is Mr. Bear.
Yeah.
And you kind of go out of your way to let everybody know you're not talking about Smokey the Bear, but
Yeah.
but but it is
I can't say that.
right. Exactly. But it is a TV bear who does
Yes.
advertisements, right?
Yeah.
And who essentially in a funny way kind of lives a human life, right? Um,
Yeah.
and so where did the kind of idea generation for that come around?
Well, I think I've always liked cartoons, and of course, Smokey Bear is there, and Yogi Bear is there,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
all these bears that you see on TV, and I've always had a real fascination with bears. I actually think they're a fascinating animal.
okay,
But I just thought I thought it would be funny if a guy's on an airplane and he's worried about somebody sitting by him, and then he sees a bear get on, and nobody's astonished that the bear's flying. He just hopes the bear doesn't sit by him. Because he's big and he takes up a lot of space. But the bear is not a good animal. He's not a nice animal, and he sits
yeah,
with the guy and he talks all sorts of things that this guy doesn't want to talk about, and but eventually things shift.
yeah, no,
And
exactly.
so,
Well, I
yeah, and
mean,
so for
with
me, it was one of those things where I think it's just funny. And the weird thing is, I actually saw some reviews where people said bears can't fly on airplanes. I was like,
right,
whoa, no joke, they can't fly on airplanes. I did not know that. Or
exactly, yeah,
I
yeah,
don't understand this. I think it's about bestiality. I went, wait a minute, a cartoon bear.
right,
And
exactly,
even if
exactly,
it is, it is. What can I tell you? I mean, for heaven's sake,
yeah.
people are that tickle the hell out of me.
Well, people somehow think fiction needs to make sense, which
Yeah, yeah,
which which
no,
makes no sense. I mean, life in and of itself rarely makes sense. So why should
right.
fiction of all things? I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, fiction tends to make more sense than life a lot of times. And
it
and there's a
does, it
plot,
does.
there's a plot to the story. So I guess in that sense it does make sense. But the idea that it has to make sense, that wait a minute, bears, what about the cartoon bear? The fact that people get obsessed with that just tickles me. I think what makes it funny is that it's a world where cartoon bears live and exist with alongside humans, or at least one does. At least one
Yeah,
cartoon bear.
yeah,
And
no,
so,
absolutely,
to me, that's the joke. That's the joke.
exactly. Yeah, just have a sense of humor about it. You know what I mean? Yeah, no, it's yeah, that's one of those funny little things. Like they always say the truth is stranger than fiction, right? And yet
Right.
I've literally had and I don't know if this has happened to you as well, but I've literally had publishers tell me, well, your work of fiction isn't believable enough. And it's like, well, wait a minute. What? Like if you're gonna tell me it's not well written enough or there's gaps in the story,
Yeah,
okay.
that's a different
But
thing. Yeah.
believable, I mean, what does that even mean?
Well, the worst. One of the things I always loved about horror is they were some of the best readers. They were really widely read, but there's a new wave of readers who are restricted themselves to a sort of a narrow vision of what horror is. And the few stories of mine that have been in horror anthologies where the editor is also the author of a specific kind of horror, they
Mhm.
expect every story in there to be like that. And
Right.
if it isn't, they don't know what to do with it. And so I think it's become a much more restricted kind of fiction. And part of that is due to people feeling they need to control fiction. They need to have it controlled. They need to have it digested before they eat it,
Right.
sort of like a mama bird feeding them a chewed up worm.
Right. Well, I was going to touch on this later, but we're just segueing right into it because it's perfect. The in your introduction in here, you have a little warning, real short, and you just write another thing. I don't do trigger warnings. No way a writer knows what triggers someone. Look at it this way. I wrote it. That's advisable enough. If you're of a sensitive nature, my work is not for you in any arena, which I love. But in today's climate where we have we've got certain states banning books, and we've got people getting canceled all over for something they did 20 years ago or
Yeah.
whatever, and and there are those some people really want those trigger warnings, right? And and yet I'm not sure that's conducive for artists all that much. So once you touch
Well,
on that.
I wouldn't. I mean, I was telling you the truth. I don't know what a good trigger warning is because something wouldn't upset me would upset somebody else, vice versa, maybe. And life's just full of little disappointments. You're gonna have them. That's the way it works. And it's also it makes you be able to live life better to realize that not everybody's out there pulling your weenie. You're going to have to deal with the good and the bad. And outside of Twitter, nobody gives a shit. So when you're out there, you've got to be able to, understand that people aren't there to give you a participation trophy and pat you on the back and tell you what a wonderful person you are. And that, I like you, I like me, but sometimes I don't like those other son of a bitches. And that's just all there is to it. And
Right.
The problem is not that they, if somebody's offended by something, I understand that. Quit reading it. I'm not making you read it.
Yeah.
And the kind of stuff I do is dark, and not always. I write a lot of things that aren't, but I write a lot of things that are, and that's pretty, I think, obvious from the books and the reviews and the quotes and So to me, if you're that big an idiot that you can't figure it out till you come across something that offends you, then there's nothing I can do for you. And and some of the ideas is that it's really a small group of people on right and left side politically, and not to get political, but it's on both sides.
Yeah.
And I always
Agreed.
said, that because the right wants them to get rid of Huckleberry Finn because it's anti-racist, and the left wants them to get rid of it because it's got a word that offends them, and it talks about races of the time. He's doing something right. And as Mark Twain once said, he said, when you find yourself on the side of the majority, you need to rethink things.
Right.
And I think there's something to that, but I think that's what makes that book so brilliant. And I don't know why people are so determined to tear down classics like that, because when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, I lived in a racist environment, and those books taught me a different way of looking at things. That one,
Exactly.
To Kill a Mockingbird, they both did. And I'm so glad they're in my life and still are.
Yep. 100% agree. One of the things, okay, so obviously, I'm a writer, but I also edit here with Starlite, and so because of that, we read a lot of stories that come in, right? A lot of submissions, and one of the things that really strikes me when I read your prose and your stories is that two things. First off, that they're unapologetic, and the writing is so unafraid. And one of the things that I notice on a regular basis is there are a lot of writers out there trying to be careful, and I'm not sure that you can. I shouldn't say you can't. You probably can, but it makes your job so much harder.
Right. I mean, it depends on the person. I mean, and the thing is, if you naturally write one way, it's not up to you to decide how I should write anyway. I don't. It's not, it has nothing to do with it. When excuse me, when I'm writing, I'm trying to capture the characters in the story. And some people, I believe, think that all genre fiction should be reader friendly.
Right.
And my feeling is I'm not just doing genre fiction, I'm doing fiction. You can call it genre fiction, or you can call it literary fiction, or you can call it a combination, or you can call it shit. But what it is I'm writing it, and it's my fiction. And I don't care what you think. I always have a motto. I've said it many times, is when I'm writing, I write like everybody I know is dead. I'm not trying to please anybody looking over my shoulder or some such. Now, after I've written it, I'm hoping people like it, of course. I mean, and I go out to market and whatever, but I never try to market it as what it is not. And nothing bothers me more than some young punk just out of college who wants to give me the TED lecture, about how these things are and how they should be treated, because that's not the way it works. Fiction is meant to be challenging. Sometimes it's meant to be savage. Sometimes it's not about pretty manners. Now, some stories might be and can be, and I read stories like that, and I've enjoyed many, but most of the things that I think last are things that challenge the status quo, or trying to tell you something straight on without dressing it up in some kind of little sailor suit. It's trying to tell you that life can be ugly, and there's some ugly people out there, and crime can be ugly, because we're all fascinated by it, because there's a part within us that worries and knows that we, under certain circumstances, probably are capable of a lot of things that we despise. I mean, what makes us better is that we don't do that. We don't step over that line. But the reason there's a fascination with crime and horror is that we recognize those things in ourselves.
Absolutely, 100% agree. And sometimes stepping over that line, you can be living a normal life for a decade, and then all of a sudden 1 or 2 days happens where you're over that line, and boom, there's no going back.
Yeah.
And yeah, so but I agree with you. I was talking with Peter Ferris a couple months ago on the show, and he's a author as well, and we were commenting on the kind of the role of art in a lot of ways, because at the end of the day, sometimes, at least, not all the time, certainly, but not with like rom-coms or young adult romance and stuff like that. But a lot of the time, as an artist or as a writer, you want to affect the reader in a way that might not always be positive. You might want to,
absolutely.
You almost want to sear them or scar them a little bit with certain kind of stories.
Yeah, and readers for the most part, I think most people, although I'm beginning to worry about them, but I think most people tend to know, what's good and what's not, and what's stupid and what isn't. I do think there's a higher level of people who are willing to accept bizarre fantasy ideas as reality. What is it? Biden's actually Trump, Trump's actually JFK. I mean, whatever kind of insanity. There are people that embrace that, and lizards, I mean,
yeah.
I hear this shit about the lizards from outer space that are running things, and I just think that's so hysterical, because it's one of the main modes of science fiction, and people don't seem to have the ability to spread those things apart now and say, okay, this is made up. This is entertainment, and this may stand for this, but it doesn't mean it is this. So I don't know, it does scare me a little bit, because I've never, when I was growing up, those were always the nuts that were over in the corner over here, with the aluminum foil hats. But now, you're starting to see some of those people for real.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it is, I think nowadays, with the amount of information we have at our disposal at any time, normally a phone in your pocket or whatever, it's almost more. I think critical thinking is probably more important now than it has been, because
exactly.
We have access to so much information that.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And part of it, schools have kept trimming down teaching and trying to fit religious patterns or political patterns. Like one state may say, well, politically we're more this way, or religiously we're more this way, so therefore history shouldn't be what history is. Let's just make it fit what we want it to do. Now, we always do that to some extent. All history, depending on the generation, and it's always good for history to evolve and find new things. But some of these things, like, I think they actually had a textbook some years back where they called slavery undocumented workers. And I just thought, wow, that is really pushing it right there. Undocumented workers. So, I mean, I think that's why fiction needs to be there. It's why it needs to show you the ugly side. It needs to challenge the ugly side. It needs to show you the good side, but it needs to challenge that as well.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you have the good side that's made up, like in the 50s. I mean, there's so many things about the 50s I love, and there's so many things about the 50s I hate. I think that's true of every generation. But, back then, we were the best there was, because we won the war, and we, so on. And some of that was true. We, at that moment in time, we were pretty damn special. And I think we still are in many ways. But some of that's mythology, and people have to be able to sort. Yeah.
No, and of course, what they try to do is when it's in the past like that, they try to just save the mythology, right?
Yes.
So it was
the legend, as they said in The Man Who Shot Liberty Down.
Right. It like life was great for everyone, but it didn't seem all that great for the brown people. But
nope. Brown people, gay people, for that matter, women in the 50s and 60s, women. And what I I said this the other day too, is I hear these things, oh, the boomers, the boomers. Well, we were the civil rights era. We
Yep.
were also at the tail end of it, the women's right era and the gay rights era. And we were the people that were opposed to wars that had nothing to do with us or with anything that mattered. You know, people could debate that if they wanted. I mean, I nearly went to prison for refusing to go, but the Vietnam War, for which I was, against and still am. And I think time has proved out that it was, now it's one of our trading partners and people go there for vacation. So it didn't turn into be what they wanted. But the point is the 60s were a very disruptive and changing time. And probably the most important thing of that era was it caused people to start trying to look at life itself and say, there might be alternatives. There might be different ways to live. There might be different ways to stand outside of what has gone before. Maybe I don't need a three-piece suit and a white shirt and a black tie and polished shoes every day of the week. Maybe God is not in his heavens and everything is all right. So I think that was one of the great things of that era,
Yeah. Which makes any era that does that, it makes the establishment unhappy.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if it's it doesn't matter if it's a three-piece suit or,
really, yeah, right. But then it really made them unhappy because you got to understand that era, nobody had thought about it outside of that. We were all on the same train. We're all on the same train track. We're getting fed the same advertising shit. And that's when advertising itself became a power, was in the 50s.
Right.
Yeah. Right after World War II. And then people began to realize that it had power outside of whatever it was selling. It was selling it to you and convincing you that you needed it. Yep. When sometimes you damn sure did not need it. And everybody was trying to keep up with the Joneses, as they said,
Yeah.
So to me, I think that was a changing time. I think we're going through some trials and tribulations now that I've never seen anything like this, but that doesn't mean that back then it was all pristine. It was not.
Exactly. Yeah. No doubt. Okay. So I was passed on the word, which seems to be very true, that you have a large fan contingency in Italy. Talk to me about that. Where did that come from? How did that happen?
Can't answer all those questions because they're a mystery to me. But in about 2001, I think it was right, I think before the towers and all, whenever that happened, I can't, but we were over there. They brought us over, paid mine and my wife's way. And it was our first time to Italy. And they brought me over to the Turin Book Fair to sign copies of The Drive-In, one of my novels that was, doing pretty well over there. It was printed, and they said, okay, we're going to go to the book fair. And we went, and they didn't have any books for me to sign. But it turned out the reason they sold them all before I got there, because there was a review that had been written that said even if you couldn't read or write, you should learn just to read that book. And that review was a powerful review by an Italian writer. And so all of a sudden, there was interest in my work. And then by the time the next year rolled around, they brought us back again, and it was even more ferocious. I got to where people would recognize me on the street in Italy. I would be going to the train station and people go, Joe Lansdale, and it was very strange. And there were people that would literally jump up and down and touch me and all sorts of stuff. And I had never encountered that. Michael Conley once said one of the funniest things he ever saw. Me and him were over there for a book festival. He said was the paparazzi chasing me down the street.
Right. That's awesome.
But I can't tell you beyond that. Just something about, what they've done, that they've developed two schools of writing based on my writing. And I've always tell them when I've talked to them, the first thing I did is don't copy me. That the whole point is to do you, right. Do you. You can learn from other people. I've learned from many writers, but do you. And but as to why I'm so popular over there, I couldn't give you an honest answer, and I've never heard anyone that could. I think that they're fascinated with the way I tell stories because it was so different, at least then, in the way they told stories.
Okay.
And I think I seem to be much more accessible. And so it's changed a lot of the way they write stories now, which is amazing to think some little guy from East Texas has had that had that
Yeah,
effect.
exactly. Exactly. Well, you know what, Joe? I was talking to Peter Ferris a couple months ago, and he, for whatever reason, similarly, is really big in France. And yet, so he's on like bestseller lists and stuff like that in France, but here in the US, he can't even get the things that are on bestseller lists in France. He can't even get published in the US. And he's from Georgia, so it's like, I'm just, do you have any, and you might not.
Here's the thing. I sell more books here. I sell more books in the United States, but it's a bigger country. And Italy's about the size of East Texas. So that's one thing, but the other thing between my American sales and my Italian sales, but I also sell in France, Germany, Japan, China, you name it, all over the world. But for whatever reason, the Italians identify much better with the work than some people in the US. They get it. They understand literary references. They've actually read a few books, and it makes it kind of fun. I mean, I went into one bookstore and we saw Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Lansdale, and I thought, damn, what's up with that? I mean, for a while I thought they only had one book, mine, and that's why it was doing so well, But now they published, tons of my books, and Italians always send me pictures of stacks and rows, and you can go in Italian bookstores, a lot of them, and they have a Lansdale section,
Nice.
So in that way, they're I think more active with my work than here. But on the other hand, I can't knock here either. I do pretty well.
Right. Yes. Okay. So that's my new goal. I need a Townsley section somewhere at some point.
Right.
So have you noticed anything, by the way, because Peter mentioned that he sees quite a difference in the publishing industries between France and the U.S. just in terms of kind of he was saying in France they give you a lot more kind of time to build a readership, and they just seem to have a lot more respect for the written word.
That hadn't been my experience in France. I'm published in France, but book companies I used to be with Gallimard, but I didn't think they were doing anything for me. So we moved, but I've been with several companies and they always go out of business. So I don't know that they give me more time. I don't get that. That may just be his experience because they like his books and they're really promoting them or they're clicking, but in the US, the difference now is they used to give you a lot more time in the US, and I had the advantage when I started. There were a lot more places where you could write crummy fiction and sell it, because you were learning. It was on the job training, and you don't have a lot of that anymore. And it is more difficult because it's less and less about selling books because the companies in general are not owned by families anymore and by people that were interested in literature. And it wasn't back then, it was about making a profit, not making a mega profit. They were proud of their books, and they could, they were able to pay their bills and do well, but they realized that they were publishing some books that were never going to make a profit, but they thought they needed to be published. Well, that kind of book selling is long gone because a lot of the industries like Bertelsmann that owns, where I am, Little Brown Wall and other, little niches, like that. And Random House owns just about everything else with a few exceptions. But I think that they're just there to make money. And also the other thing that happened that was unfortunate is that they begin to view themselves and their business model to be closer to film than to books. And so they're looking not to make money, they're looking to make mega money. And I just think it gets harder and harder. And I'm doing better now than every year I do better than I did the year before. Now I say that, and then next year I'll probably be out in the corner with a tin cup and some pencils. But I do better every year, and have been. I mean, I might have a slump here a little bit, but since 1986, I've kind of gone up with like a few little rough spots there, but they weren't rough enough to really affect my life or my career. And I'm not I wouldn't call myself rich, but I'm well off. And for me, rich is when you could quit now and never have to work again and you'll be fine. And even then I wouldn't quit because I don't
Right.
really do it for the money, but I
Yeah.
do it for the money.
Yeah. 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 No, of course.
Meaning that I write what I want, but I have to make a living doing it or I couldn't do it.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So I think that I want to touch for a second on the difference between, because all of us as writers, oftentimes we're juggling multiple things, right? Sometimes you're on a novel over
Right.
here, maybe a novella over here, you got a short story or two, in the works here. But what, when you are writing, when you set out and you're writing, say, a short versus a longer piece, a novel, novella, whatever it might be, how is the process different for you?
I think that the writing itself is pretty much the same. You write as well as you can, but I think that I have a sort of built-in, kind of clock or something that says this will take this long, this will take less. And I generally know the idea as a short story or a novel when I start it, but not always. I've written,
Mhm.
I've found I've had novellas turned into novels more than once, but I generally kind of know, and the gear is so built in, I don't feel it shifting. I don't have to ride the clutch to change that gear. When I was younger, I could really tell I was changing gears. I would have to take a few days to get in the framework. I might read more short stories because I was going to write one. I read all the time anyway, but I had to read more because I had to get in that gear. When I wrote screenplays, I would have to get in that kind of mindset. And then when I wrote comics, I would get into that mindset. And even when I wrote flash fiction or whatever, it would, I might take a day or an extra day, but that went away real quick. After a few years, I would just say, okay, I know what this is. And I would write it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I found that when I'm writing a novel, it affects me more. Like and I don't mean that necessarily in a good way. Like, but I find myself thinking about it all the time. Like I live with it. You know what I mean? You wake up and you're thinking about it. Whereas with a short story, it's usually 2, 3, 4 sessions, boom, knock it out, move on, and you might really like what you did, but I
Yeah.
don't, kind of.
It's interesting. It's interesting because I used to do that. And then probably about mid late 90s, I said, this is making me miserable. I don't like this. I want to write and I want to enjoy writing, but it's making me miserable thinking about this thing all the time. And then some of them really dark ones like Walls of Shadows. I'm living inside this dark world for days.
Right.
It takes you a few hours or a couple of days to read a novel, but it might take you 4 to 6 months to write one or longer. I'm generally 3 to 4 months, once in a while longer. Moon Lake took longer than say More Better Deals or Donut Legion or what have you. So
Yep.
it varies. But what I did is I taught myself to turn that off about 98% of the time. So the rest of my life, I'm not thinking about it. I get up in the morning and I write. And when I get through, I'm done for the day thinking about that.
Gotcha.
Because I think it takes away from my life. And if I want to be a good writer, I need to live life. I need to,
Absolutely.
be involved in just common things.
Yeah.
I don't want to write books that have the stink of the library on them all the time. I
Mm.
want something that feels like that, I've been out in the world, even if it's just to talk to people over a hamburger.
Yep.
And then to hear other people talk, to hear people say things I don't want to hear. And have people say things I don't believe, because
Yeah.
otherwise you put yourself in a bubble. And that's one reason you have a lot of these people that are so easily offended and that want everybody to be controlled, is
Yeah.
because they can't live in real life.
Right.
They have to be constantly within this circle. And there's also that thing that you can't always tell somebody from what they say. It's better to tell from what they do,
Do. Yeah.
because just because you're saying all the cool key words doesn't mean that you believe that, or it doesn't mean you can live up to that. You got to walk the walk if you're going to talk the talk.
Yeah.
And a lot of those people I don't find particularly interesting, because all they can do is talk about who needs to be censored and who offended them. I'm a very much a social writer. I mean, if you read my work, you'll see for a long time I have been writing about the sort of inequality for black people and gay people and women, so on and so on. But sometimes you write things from a perspective that people have weird interpretations. I wrote a story where a guy that's, and he's looking at a woman and he's kind of noticing that she's got a little wiggle in her walk, and so he likes that. And somebody was reviewing and says, well, you think he would know better than that? No, my biology does not know better than that. And I'm 71 and I'm happily married, and I still go, oh yeah, I see that, because that's biology. And when you're writing about characters and you're trying to make them real, it's good to acknowledge those realities, because readers relate to that. They don't relate to the person who somehow can't, have that whole aspect of sexuality, or can't have that aspect of anger or passion or happiness. I mean, books are about being a little bit nutty, and also, does that mean that person's bad because he notices? Not at all. It means that person is biological, and it means the human race will continue. But when they quit noticing on either end of it, male, female, whatever, that's when the human race doesn't have a chance of continuing,
Yeah. Well, and we put ourselves these days. Okay, I'm going to be honest here. When the internet started, I was so off on this, I can't even tell you. When the internet started back in the, mid to late 90s, my idea was, oh, this is going to be good because there's there's a chance for democratic dialogue in a way, because everybody gets to voice their opinion. Now, what it's turned into is we all have our own little echo chambers, and we don't expand from that. We all of a sudden don't want to hear. We have access to all this information and we don't want to hear it because it doesn't agree with the narrative that we have going on.
Right. When it first came out, my first thought is, oh my God, they haven't read Philip K. Dick. And it pretty much turned out like I thought it would, and it scared me because the whole democratic dialogue is not that democratic. It's more like, tell me what I want to hear, and help me shit on everybody that doesn't think like I do.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what it's become. And I think in a lot of ways, that's why, we keep on going back to the things like the trigger warnings and stuff. But I think that's why those things are so prevalent these days, is because, people, again, people talk all the time about having a safe space, right? Their safe space. Well, art should not be safe. There's nothing about art that should be safe. So
you have a safe space during war, but a book should allow you to, be able to get outside your safe space, to experience different feelings and different attitudes, some that make you mad, some that, some of my characters are not good characters. I hope to make you mad. So you go, well, I don't like that. I don't want to be, that's what I want.
Exactly.
But for you to say, oh, you can't write about that because I don't want that, that's missing the whole point of it. And it's, I hate when I look and see that the 50s were actually more open-minded about that than now, because back then, even though you had that going on, you had the McCarthyism and all that stuff. You also, a little later on, you had John Kennedy, and his whole point was education. A flawed human being, but everybody is, and he was more positive than negative. And then you take somebody like LBJ, definitely a flawed human being and probably the greatest civil rights president after Lincoln, but a terrible war president because he was still trying to fight like World War II. And the guy, there was not he never missed a chance to make racist comments, but yet he was a civil rights president, and he gave us Medicare. I remember Ronald Reagan. I always find it funny. Put out a long playing record, how horrible that Medicare would be, and how it would be the end of our society as we knew it, the end of capitalism. Everybody be going around calling each other comrade or something. But once they got Medicare, he was, oh no, I wasn't really against it. I just had a better idea for it. I call bullshit on that. Right. And then you have the same people that, oh my God, the socialism, and yet now the government, get your hands off my Medicare. And of course, it's a government program, that stupid idiots. And so, Social Security, the same thing. I'm not a socialist, but I'm a capitalist with a small c. meaning that I'm probably not much of that either. I just think that you take what works best and quit trying to come find a box to fit yourself in completely, because I don't fit in any of those.
Mm-hmm.
I I tend to vote one way because all the other way has gone nuts. But when in the old days, I used to could vote some Democrats and some Republicans, because there were
Right.
some Republicans that were in certain kinds of they might have a certain job that I thought they were better at
Mm-hmm.
in. And
Sure.
now though, every office is an absolutely blind political office that supports everything. Where before you could just talk about how this money was handled here or not handled here. So that way I could choose Democrats, I could choose Republicans. I felt like an American, and now I have to totally dismiss one side because I think they're crazy, and the ones I'm supporting are mildly crazy. So,
Yeah.
we don't really have what I would like, but I never miss voting. I'm a big believer in it because otherwise I can't complain.
Yeah. Well, oh, absolutely. And we have this thing nowadays where it used to be that it was acceptable and even looked at as part of your job as a politician to reach across the aisle and
Absolutely.
and actually make a deal for your constituents. Now it's, if I give an inch, that's seen as weakness, and I can't ever do that.
Yeah.
So neither side gets anything done.
Well, right. I was watching this thing the other day. It was a 3-part thing on Arnold Schwarzenegger,
Mhm.
and it was really interesting. It was on Netflix. And here was a guy, I always thought of him as a conservative back then. And
Right.
when he was, and I tended to be a little bit more the other way, but I always thought he was kind of a common sense guy. I don't feel like I have to agree with everything someone does. And I don't feel like I have to check boxes, so I'll be sure that I'm recognized as a Democrat or whatever it is. But here's a guy that now seems like the most middle of the road common sense guy you could come across. But it wasn't that way then. I mean, even
Nope.
Reagan and George W. Bush seemed normal compared.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't for Reagan's politics, but I thought he did some good things. Even
Mhm.
Nixon was one of those guys that wanted health care for everybody. He pushed that. He invented the Environmental Protection Agency, all of those things. So it used to be different. There was like a key issue usually that like the war with during my era when I was growing up in the 60s, that was the key issue. Abortion, maybe that was a key issue, but there were other issues that you took into consideration too. And we just don't have that anymore. You
No.
have people that are like a cult, or they're like in camps, and I find that on both sides. But I just find one side crazier than the other.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. It's true. So let's go back for a second. You've had a long career, and you've got a lot more to do too. Uh, but what made you? And I'm talking way back here. What made you want to be a writer? How did that process start for you?
When I was about 4 years old, my sister-in-law, my brother's 17 years older than me, or right at it. So they were newlyweds essentially.
Yeah.
She wanted to, and they didn't live in our house. He was out when I was born. My dad was 42 when I was
Sure.
born. My mom was 38. I always
Gotcha.
say my dad was born in 1909. Mark Twain was still alive. Wild Bill, I mean Buffalo Bill was still alive. All these people that you think about, so it's a different thing.
Yep.
But and my dad couldn't read or write, and I think that's kind of important to note because he sure wanted me to. But she
Okay.
brought me a batch of comic books, and what they were called like funny animal books. We didn't call them comic books back then. We called them funny books. And so she brought those to me, and she would read them to me, and I could memorize them almost as fast as she read them to me. And so I would tell her back, but I wanted her to read them. And so she said,
Right.
"Wow, we got to get this kid reading." And so I was reading before I went to kindergarten. And my mother was a big on reading. She loved writers. And she told me about writers when I was very young. And so
Mhm.
as soon as I discovered comic books, I wanted to write and draw comic books. But I was not a great artist, but I was a good writer, I thought.
Right.
I mean, for a 4-year-old, I'm not thinking nobody was flocking to get those comics, but I was trying to do that. And I didn't think, oh, this is my career, because I didn't know what a career was. I just
Sure.
knew that this is what I wanted to do, was tell these stories. And then by the time I was 9, I was starting to complete a few things like a poem here or a little article here, nothing special. But by that point, I thought, wow, I want to do this. And then when I read Edgar Rice Burroughs when I was about 11 or so, I didn't want to do it. I had to do it. And he was probably the most influential writer in my life. I read some people who wrote better, perhaps. Also, I was influenced by Kipling. I was influenced by Jack London, Mark Twain. Mark Twain a little bit more later that, but Burroughs hit that 11-year-old boy part of me just about as good as anything could have. And I was just a fanatic for everything I could find that he wrote. And so I owe him more than any other writer. He's still my sentimental favorite. I did a visit out in Tarzana at the office where he used to write. That's all that really remains. Tarzana used to be his ranch. And so I went out there and it was just amazing. I got to sit at his desk and look through all these editions of these wonderful books. And even now, if I see a cover for one of those things, I get that little palpitation in my heart, and there are certain times in the year, the summer, when I used to read out under a tree or on the porch, I'll walk outside and there's just a strange nostalgic feeling that's somewhat like a change in the weather. And I can still feel it.
Right. That's awesome. All right. So you touched on some of those writers. So those were some influences you had, when you were starting out.
Early on.
What about? Are there any writers who, as you've gotten older and had a longer career, who's in your mind, it's one of those things when somebody has a book out, whoever it might be, that name, it's like, oh, I got to get to that.
Yeah, a little less of that than before, but not because I'm not reading, but because I'm reading stuff outside of popular reading a lot of times, or I'm rereading old things, or I'm finding old things I haven't read. A lot of modern stuff I don't like because I can see people trying their best not to hurt anybody's feelings, and it hurts my feelings. That hurts my feelings. And but when I was I guess in the mid '60s, I discovered there was Thriller, which was this TV show. And I started noticing there were names that went with the stories. And then when I saw Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, I started noticing these names. And then I started reading people like Robert Bloch, who probably was my favorite writer through the 60s and early 70s, almost the 70s too. And I've never lost my love for him because he changed fiction, And then there was Richard Matheson and Ray Bradbury and Charles Beaumont, my friend William F. Nolan. All of these people influenced me in one way or another. And when I went to college, I had classes where I had to read Fitzgerald and Hemingway, Flannery O'Connor's Good Man is Hard to Find, lots of short stories by a variety of authors, Faulkner, you name it. And that began to change. And I started just going to the library when I had a study session or a break, and I just picked something off the shelf and read it. And I started reading all of Hemingway and all of Faulkner that I wanted to read. I wasn't as fond of him. And then I read F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I read a lot of short stories. The Great Gatsby, I just adored. We had to read that in class. And then Flannery O'Connor, oh my God, I think she's the greatest short story writer America's ever produced. She had a certain themes that she returned to, but she also wrote that great novel Wise Blood. She wrote 2 novels, but Wise Blood is like unbelievably wonderful. John Huston filmed it, and he made a very good film of it as well. And so she was probably one of the biggest influences. And then but before that, I also read a guy named Keith Laumer, who was a science fiction writer, but he wrote one book called Fat Chance. It was a crime novel, and he dedicated it to Raymond Chandler and Philip Marlowe. So it's no more sooner that I finished that book, I saw on the paperback on the stands, The Big Sleep. Hey, that's that writer he mentioned. And then I thought, okay, he's the impossible meat version of Chandler. Chandler's the guy. And so I started reading Chandler, and then that led me to, Hammett and James Cain, who I love. And I'm still, a big fan of all those authors I've mentioned. Some like Burroughs are sentimental. I've read a lot of Jack London. I remember, and Philip Jose Farmer I was a big fan of his. We once sat and talked about Jack London for about an hour and a half, which was great. But And then when I got into modern times, I James Lee Burke.
Oh yeah.
I thought, and still, fantastic author.
Yeah.
I like Ace Atkins a whole lot. I think Ace
Okay.
is really, really good. Short story writers are among my favorites. So I read a lot of short story writers.
Yeah.
Ellen Gilchrist, was a favorite of mine. I mean, if we start doing this, we'll never get out of it because it goes
Right.
goes on and on and on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm with you too. I love short stories. I grew up reading, between Hammett and Chandler and a ton of Stephen King, of course, when I was younger.
Yeah, I read Stephen King too, who I liked a lot. Still do. And
Yeah.
his boys are too. Man, I'm nuts
Yeah.
about Owen King's stuff. Owen's
Yeah.
just fantastic.
Actually, we've got Owen coming on in August, so that'll be fun.
Yeah. Well, Owen. Oh, I mean, I love Joe's work too. Joe's great, but Owen somehow has there's an angle at which kind of fits with me considerably. Let's put it like that.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, he's a favorite. There are other. Stephen Graham Jones is a buddy, but I love his work. He told me he was at a panel that he and I were on. I think it's the first time we met. Mm-hmm. And they asked me what I did, and I said I do what genre I wrote, and I said I do the Lansdale genre. And he said when he heard that, something went click. Right.
Right.
But he like me, he's all over the place, and you got Sean Cosby. I read all of Sean's work. I actually haven't read his last one, but I have it. And there's so many other writers I out there that when I want to think of them, I can't.
Right, of course, yeah.
Yeah. Andy Rausch, he's good. I mean, there's a lot of different writers that I read. And as soon as I leave, I'll think of somebody else.
Oh, of course. That's always how it works. Yeah.
Gene Shepard, I used to read a lot. Yeah. Gene Shepard, who wrote for Playboy, and he wrote, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash. And Christmas Story is based on his short stories.
Oh, okay.
But his stories were a lot darker.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I also heard, we're going to finish it up here in just a sec, but I also heard that you had a movie adaptation coming out fairly soon. Is that?
Yeah. Correct? Well, I've had several in the past, but I've got The Thicket coming out from Tubi in October with Peter Dinklage and Juliette Lewis. And, I had the Happy Leonard TV show and Bubba Hotep and Cold in July, and Christmas with the Dead, which was a real low budget film. And, I've had stuff on Love, Death, and Robots adapted there, and Creep Show, and so I mean, there's a lot of my stuff's been around. I used to write for Batman the Animated Series. Boy, I know,
yeah, very cool.
I love doing that. Yeah, big Batman. Yeah, this one comes out in October 6th.
And what's the title again?
The Thicket.
Right. Okay.
It's one of my best books, I think.
Very cool. All right. Well, I look forward to that. So guys, this is Things Get Ugly. This comes out shortly, and this is a collection of crime fiction, with some genre bending in there, by Mr. Joe R Lansdale. I appreciate having you on today, man. It's been a great conversation, and thank you so much.
You're welcome.
In this top secret